How's everybody this morning? Let's stand up and pray. So we have the Colorellis with us today. So that was, I don't know if you guys remember or knew, but Jeremy and Michelle got married yesterday, and it was absolutely one of the coolest, most beautiful weddings I've ever had the privilege of even attending, much less being part of. So you guys are just a beautiful couple, and it was just awesome. So anyway, congratulations. So let's pray. Lord, thank you for your goodness and your grace and your blessing upon our lives. Just ask you to anoint me afresh and anew and help me to minister your word in Jesus' name. Amen. Be seated. How's everybody feeling? All right? Okay, we're going to look at some scripture this morning. I'll start in Matthew. And I still want to talk about change and hopefully make some things practical. Matthew chapter 8, verse 11, Jesus makes this statement. He says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I've got like some really heavy bass or something in my voice that's feeding back, or something. Thank you, Roseanne. So what is the kingdom of heaven? Most people think it's some place you go after you die. But in reality, what I think the best definition comes from, there's a book called Wisdom Jesus by a scholar. I can't ever pronounce her name, so I'm not even going to try. Her first name is Cynthia. Her last name is some French name that I can't pronounce. But she's a PhD level scholar, and she says the kingdom, from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, is not so much about a location that you go to when you die or a place that you go to, as much as it is a state of consciousness that you come from. So if you think about the kingdom of heaven as a state of consciousness, and you can kind of see that in this passage. It's the story of the centurion whose servant is healed. He goes to Jesus. Jesus offers to come to the man's home to heal his servant. And I can't get into that. There's something in that word servant that's tricky. But anyway, never mind. So he shows up. And he says, you don't have to come to my house, just speak the word only and my servant will be healed. And Jesus says, I've not found such great a faith, not even in Israel. And then he says, many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And so it's not about death, it's about the healing and deliverance of his servant based upon the level of consciousness or faith that he has arrived at, that is allowing him then to sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom in that moment. And so Jesus goes on, and he never says, wow, my power has made your servant well. He looks and says, your faith has made him well. And so it's that shift of consciousness that allows us to access the kingdom, which is why Jesus could say the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So if people go to heaven, not if, but when people go to heaven when they die, it's because their bodies, this limited level of consciousness that's locked into time and space and physical reality is no more. The lights go out on that. When that happens, then this whole new conscious awareness opens up that it's the kingdom of heaven. But what Jesus is saying is you can access that before you die. Make sense? And he gives examples of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what I'd like to do, and this may just be one message or it may turn into a whole series, I don't know. But what I'd like to do is look at the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and look at what did they do that allowed them to access that state of consciousness? Because then Jesus says the sons of the kingdom will be in outer darkness, which is not hell. So we read these as heaven and hell afterlife verses, but there's no reason to do that. If you read them as present tense moments, then what you can see is that Jesus is saying there are those who will access this state of consciousness that is the kingdom of heaven, and then there will be those who have a right to access it, but if their consciousness doesn't shift, then they're in outer darkness, which is a place of consciousness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that based on your state of consciousness, you are either living in heaven or you are living in hell, based on what you're creating for yourself internally, right? So Buddha said pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And what he meant by that was that stuff's going to come at us in life that's going to be hurtful and painful, but then the way we respond to it in our mental and emotional being is going to determine whether we amplify that pain into more suffering or whether we process that pain and get out of it. Does that make sense? So let's go back and look at Abraham. So come with me to Genesis 12. Everybody doing all right? Genesis 12. Now, Abram is Abraham before his name change, right? So in Genesis 12, verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country and from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in you all families of the earth shall be blessed.' So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran." And then come with me to chapter 15. Verse 1, it says, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. I am your exceedingly great reward.' But Abram said, 'Lord God, what will you give me, seeing,'" everybody just notice the language, "'seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus?' And then Abram said, 'Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir.' And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, 'This one shall not be your heir, but one who shall come from your own body shall be your heir.' And then he brought him outside, and he said, 'Look now toward heaven, and count the stars if you are able to number them.' And he said, 'So shall your descendants be.' And he believed in the Lord, and it was credited to him for righteousness." And then come with me to Hebrews 11, and I'll be done reading scripture, I think. Hebrews 11, verse 8. It says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out knowing not where he was going. And by faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise, for he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Okay. So let's kind of put this together. What I want you to see from this is that everything that's happening with Abraham, in order for him to manifest what God had promised him and manifest really what was the desires of his heart, he had to leave where he had been. And we think about this strictly in terms of physical location, right? He says, get out of your country, get out of away from your family, and get out of your father's house. So we think about that in terms of everything that's external. But you have to understand, sometimes it really hinders us when we don't understand the cultures, the ancient Near Eastern cultures. So you have to understand that something happened in the Industrial Revolution that radically changed humanity. That really prior to the 1900s, the late 1800s, the 1900s, especially prior to the expansion of the New World and stuff, people didn't go to college. They didn't choose occupations. They didn't really leave the house, if you will, to go to work. Everything economically was based upon the family. The family was the foundation for all the economics. So one of the things people don't realize, like we did a wedding, but you got to understand, in ancient Near Eastern cultures, they didn't do weddings. They did business transactions. It's still that way. How many of you remember Francis Kayinge that came from Africa a few years ago? Has been with us a few times. So Francis, I'm trying to remember how many wives his dad had. And, and I mean, he was really Kenyan. Some of the ones that we've brought in that were Kenyan were a little bit more westernized, right? But he was really Kenyan in the sense that he came from a tribe that was very agricultural. And his father had several wives, and he had several brothers and sisters. And it was very important to Francis, when he married Beth, his wife, that he was able to give the dowry. And the dowry basically was a payment that the future husband would give to the father to basically purchase the bride. And so you didn't go fall in love and propose and all that stuff. You made a business deal with the dad, and if the dad liked the business deal, you gave him money. And so the reality is, in ancient Near Eastern cultures and ancient cultures, and even in parts of the world today, women are property, not equal level human beings. Got it? So part of the reason for that, so your wealth would be measured in many wives, and part of the reason your wealth would be measured in many wives, and part of the reason that reproduction was so important was because that, and why having boys was so important, was as much economic as anything. It wasn't really a religious thing as much as it was an economic survival thing, because you couldn't just go out and hire a workforce. You had to produce your own. You tracking with me? So the more wives and the more sons you have, the greater workforce you have to work the land or work the sheep or work the cattle or whatever you have. Right? And then you would have a family heritage that would carry on for generations. And you all did the same thing. So if you saw the movie, what's the little cartoon? Where'd Julie go? I don't see her. What's the little cartoon with that they did on the Day of the Dead? Came out a few years ago, and they're in Mexico, and it's Coco. They were all shoemakers, and he wanted to be a musician, but you can't be a musician because we're shoemakers. That is how society functioned up until really 100, 150 years ago. Got it? So my point is, you didn't just leave your family. You didn't just leave your father's house. You were making a drastic, massive break. I mean, for us, that wouldn't be a big deal, right? Because you turn 18, whatever. If you're fortunate enough, you leave home. Maybe you go get a job someplace. Maybe you leave home, you go to college, whatever. And so it's kind of a common operation in our society. So it wouldn't seem that radical to tell somebody, get out of your country, get out of your father's house, get away. But in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, it's taboo. It's breaking with all the mores. It's totally breaking with societal agreements for Abram to be able to do that. And so you have to ask yourself, what's going on internally with the character in the story? What's going on internally with Abram for him to be able to, if you will, like I did a message years ago, I called Get Out of Your Comfort Zone and Into the Blessing Zone. And I use this passage because God tells him, get away from your family, get away, everything that had made him comfortable. And if you'll do that and you'll leave that place, then I will bless you. So if you listened to last week's message or you heard last week's message, I talked about the power of agreement. and how we make agreements with our former self. We make agreements with all kinds of different things. We make agreements on many, many different levels. I talked about you can make an agreement with poverty, and you can just decide that that's how you're supposed to live, or you can make an agreement with the pursuit of material possessions, and you decide that's how you're supposed to live. You can make certain agreements with sickness and disease and health and well-being. I mean, we have a shared collective agreement that by the time you reach a certain age, your body starts breaking down. Right? I mean, that's just in the collective consciousness. Right? So we celebrate birthdays, we start anticipating certain things will start happening to us physically because that's just how it is. Well, how do you know? And why does it happen to some people and not to everybody? Part of it, I'm not saying all of it, but part of it is based on the agreement that you've made with yourself that your body's going to start breaking down at a certain age. And so your body honors the agreement that you've internalized out of the collective consciousness of what we think is supposed to happen at certain ages. Does that make sense? That's why I quit having birthdays. I know you think it's funny, but I'm being serious because we make an agreement with a number. Well, when I turn 50, this is supposed to happen. When I get past 45, this is supposed to happen. And see, all that stuff operates at an unconscious level, but your body responds to your unconscious agreements. If it didn't, there would be no reason for them to test the placebo effect on medicines before they're certified by the FDA. You know what that is, right? They have to test if you take a sugar pill and you get better, then it's just your agreement that you made with the pill. There's nothing effective or cause in the sugar pill. The cause is the agreement that unconsciously you made with the pill when with your body to get better if you took the pill. Make sense? So we can make agreements with our health. We can make we do this unconsciously, and we do it out of a collective consciousness that has been fostered by humanity that has lost its conscious connection with the kingdom of heaven and is existing in the illusion that this three-dimensional world or four-dimensional world of time and space is all there is. And so we do all this stuff, and there's this floating mass. Our translations don't reflect it, but in the original Greek language, Paul talks about this floating mass of thoughts that we are immersed in at any given point in time that influences our mind and our thinking. And so what God is really telling Abram is he's saying, look, if you want to be a vessel for the divine, then you have to exit this matrix of reality that is based upon the agreements that you have made with life, with yourself, with all these different things, that is based upon your country, your family, and your Father's house. And until you get out of that, you cannot inherit the fullness of the blessing. Does that make sense? So what we try to do oftentimes with change is we try to add something to where we already are without first letting go of where we are and what we've had. So Jesus said it this way. He said, no man takes a new patch and puts it on an old garment, or both will tear. No one takes new wine and puts it into old wineskins, or the old wineskin will burst. So it's an interesting thing when you study how they would make wine. They would put it in these wineskins, and the issue is, if you've ever watched grapes turn into wine, it's a very volatile process. It starts churning and bubbling while it's fermenting. And so what needed to happen was that the wineskin needed to be able to expand and grow with the wine as it was fermenting. And then once that process was over, the elasticity of the wineskin was lost and it was hardened. So if you put new wine in an old wineskin, it had no ability or flexibility to be able to move with the newness of what was coming. And so therefore it would burst, and both the wineskin and the wine would be lost. Make sense? And so sometimes we approach change by saying, look, I can just add this new belief. I can just add this new agreement. I can try this new thing. I can do something different here. And we're not able to get into the fullness of what we want to get into because we don't realize that in order to get to a higher level, a higher vibration, a higher level of consciousness, the kingdom of heaven, whatever you want to call it, you've got to leave where you are. You've got to get out or get out of you, if you will, what's in you based on all these different agreements. Make sense? So here's the other problem with agreements. We stay then stuck in the past and we keep perpetuating. So we looked at last week, Jesus says, don't make an oath. Don't swear by anything. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Why? So that you can change. There's a verse in the Bible, Psalm 15, that says, a man who swears to his own hurt and does not change. Think about that. A man who swears to his own hurt and does not change. So my life, I'm making a decision based on the sum total of my experiences, based on the information that I have, based on all the past agreements that I've internalized, that makes up the structure of my consciousness, the structure of my reality. And I make a decision to go a certain direction, whatever that may be. Could be a job, could be a relationship, could be a way of thinking and being in the world, could be anything. And I make an agreement with myself or something else, and this is the direction that I'm going, and then that moment is over. And life continues to happen. And as life continues to happen, I continue to accumulate more experiences, hopefully more wisdom, all kinds of stuff, right? But the problem is then I can be stuck in a past. If I'm stuck to an agreement, if I'm bound by an agreement, I'm stuck to a past that no longer exists. I'm stuck in a moment of time that has passed away. And the only existence and the only reality it has is the reality and the existence that I give it. But literally, if you can think about it, I'm carrying a delusion. Because the past is a delusion. The only place it exists is in our memory. So I can stay bound by that and then carry it with me into a present moment. And then maybe it no longer serves me to be in that place. And if I don't have the freedom to release that and move on, I'm stuck. Make sense? So you see this more clearly in Genesis 15. Because after he leaves, right, he has an encounter with the Lord that's a vision. And this is all about the structure of Abram's consciousness. It's about not just the content of it, but the structure of it. Because your mind has content, but it also has structure. And sometimes we make change harder than it has to be, or we can't change because we don't appreciate the power of structure, and we only want to change content. I'll show you what this means in this story. So Abraham's wife Sarah is barren, and he has no heir from his own body that he can give his inheritance to. Right? So it's someone else born in his house, a slave, that is going to inherit what only a son should inherit. That's the content of his situation. Got it? So the way we teach faith, or the way we teach the law of attraction, or the way sometimes we teach change is all based on content. There's a very commonly used system of therapy that counselors will use called cognitive behavioral therapy. And so one of the things that you look at cognitive cognition, you look at thoughts, how a person is thinking, and then you look at their behaviors, how that's translating, and how there's interplay with all that stuff. And so you help support a person to make change by changing their behaviors and examining the quality of their cognitions or their thinking. And so one of the things that you look for is what they call cognitive distortions or thought distortions. All right? So let me give you a couple. One of them would be mind reading. So you have an encounter with somebody, it doesn't go the way you want it to go, you walk away from that, and instead of sticking to the facts of what actually happened, you insert your own interpretation of what that person must have been thinking. Without asking or getting clarity, that can cause you problems. Fortune telling, this is another reason why agreements can be a problem. Fortune telling, I know what the future is gonna happen, and so I've already predicted it in my head, and I'm operating off of what I predicted rather than in the reality of the situation, so that can be a distortion. You got it? Or beliefs that people have. You look for beliefs that people have. I'm worthless. I'm powerless. I'm whatever. Got it? So you say, okay, well, you need to quit believing that you're worthless and start believing that you have value. See it? That's healthy change, but it's only content. It has no appreciation for the depth of structure in the way that consciousness is built. You can look at it this way. If you could think about your mindset, how about that? Is the house in which you live. Your mindset is the house in which you live. But a house is not just made up of content. And this is why people can get frustrated with change. Because if you can think about changing your mindset as a remodeling project, okay? And here's how a lot of people go about remodeling. They have a structure in their home. If you remodel your home, you're doing what? You're changing the structure. And in order to change the structure, you have to what? You have to change the content. So you have to tear some things up and out, and then you have to rebuild or put it back together. Unfortunately, what we do, the way we approach change sometimes is very unsophisticated. And what we do is we take a wrecking ball to what we don't want, or try to, and then we just throw a bunch of 2x4s and drywall and duct tape, and we just put it in a pile, and we say, look, I'm better now. Make sense? So let's see if we can identify the structure of Abraham's thinking and how God deals with it. Because we got the content. He wants to have a child, and he doesn't have a child. And God says, I'm going to give you a child. But God also deals subtly with the structure of it in here. And he begins with which sensory input is driving Abram's reality. Lord, what will you give me seeing I go childless? So his issue is he's being driven by the sensory input and the meaning he attaches to it. So we start seeing structure. He's seeing something, he's looking at it, and he's internally giving meaning to what he's seeing specifically. If you want a different example of this, so God, this is what's so cool. God meets him at the level of sight. Because the word of the Lord comes to him in a vision. If you want to see a different example of this, go into Luke chapter 24 and look at the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. After Jesus is raised from the dead, he appears to them, but they don't recognize him because their eyes are restrained. They can't see him. So the structure of their experience is not being driven by what they see. He comes alongside and he says, what's happening? And they're like, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem that doesn't know what's going on? What was the issue? They were stuck in grief. So the Lord begins to talk to them along the way, begins to open for them the scriptures, begins to expand their understanding. So they were confused about what happened. Structure has order to it, right? They had events that they were confused about what happened, and they were being driven by their grief, their feelings. So the Lord begins to talk to them, and at the end of the story, when they get set free, they make this statement. They say, "Did not our hearts burn while he talked with us?" So what happened? They're being driven at that moment by their feelings. That is the result of the meaning that they're giving to something they had experienced. So what happens is Jesus comes along and reinterprets the meaning of what happened. And then in the process, their hearts burn, so he meets them at the level of their feelings so that they can shift content based on structure. So you have to ask yourself, what is the structure of my consciousness and where I'm stuck? Am I operating primarily off of my feelings? Am I operating primarily off of what I'm seeing? Am I operating primarily off of my own rationalizing? You get it? Because if you're operating primarily off your feelings, it does me no good to sit there and look at thought distortions based on your rationalization. Because you can change that, but it's not what's driving it. What's driving it is your feelings. In this case, with Abraham, what's driving it is his own imagination of a future that he believes he will inherit. So he is creating a vision of his own future and projecting it, and based on his agreement with his own projection, he's marching towards that future even though there's other possibilities for him. Which is why I keep saying, I'm trying to say the same thing different ways. If you want to create change, if you want to create a different future, you have to go to that 0 point where anything is possible. Where you forget about the past, you forget about your interpretations, and you're not projecting a future based on your agreements. You're at a 0 point where from this moment on in my life, any number of possibilities exist. And I get to choose based on the quality of my consciousness and whether or not I'm connected to heaven or whether or not I'm connected to outer darkness. What happens? Does that make sense? So what does God do? God works with, he doesn't work against where Abram is. He understands he's stuck with his sight. So he doesn't work against it. He doesn't say, close your eyes. What's he do? He takes him outside. Now, Abram has left his house. He's traveling. So when God appears to him in a vision, where is he? He's in the desert. Maybe he's in a tent. So again, this is where you have to quit projecting your own thing. Well, God took me outside. I left my house. I looked outside. I looked at the stars. He's not taking him outside like we think about it. He's taking him outside of his own vision. He's taking him outside of his own projected future. He's taking him outside of his own meanings and his own agreements. to show him something else. So he takes him outside, and what does he say? Feel this, Abram. Feel this energy that I'm giving you. Is that what he says? Does he say, hear this word that I'm giving you? No. What does he say? He says, look, because he's dealing with structure, not just content. You see it? Look at the stars of the sky. Can you number them? So what did he do? He shifted him from looking at Eleazar of Damascus and this projected future, looking down here, if you will, to broadening his horizon. And the Hebrew word for heaven literally means the expanse. It can also mean the vault. So watch this. So he's telling him, shift your consciousness from this limited perception and look into the expanse of possibilities. Or look into the vault. What do you put in the vault? Something valuable, treasure, right? Look at the expanse of the storehouse of the treasures of possibilities that can be yours. And when you start gazing from that place, so shall your seed be. Now watch this. It's not just talking about physical seed. Not just talking about generations. It's talking about the law of karma, or the law of cause and effect, by which we can change our own destinies. Because Galatians chapter 6 says, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. So the seed comes out of the expanse. Am I back on?
Yeah.
So quit thinking about it just literally. Understand what God's doing. God's invading his consciousness in a vision with a new idea to shift him from the three-dimensional reality and his own agreements and his own projected future to looking in the kingdom of heaven, where there is expanse, where there is light, where there is treasure, right? And when he makes an agreement, when he sees into that and he makes an agreement, then God says, so shall your seed be. Or as in heaven, so on earth. So that now, from that new consciousness, or if you will, to use Jesus' words, sitting down in the kingdom of heaven, now there is a seed, there is an embryo, there is a beginning of a whole new structure of reality and life that has been given to Abram. To plant. To plant a new possibility with a new way of thinking and feeling and being. That then will reproduce after its own kind. Because whatever you sow, you shall reap. So you don't plant carrots and get tomatoes. Right? So when he can see that new future, he can see that new possibility, now he can give birth to and reproduce a totally different outcome. You see it? So we have to start examining our thinking, the structure of our thinking. What's driving this? Is it what I'm seeing? Is it what I'm feeling? Is it just the meanings that I'm giving to this? Is it that but are you visualizing? Let me give you a practical example. When, I don't think she'd mind me sharing because she's given me permission to share, but you remember a few years ago when Shelley had what they thought was a tumor on her ovaries, and she, that they were going to take it out, but she was determined that she wasn't going to go under the knife. And initially, when she thought it might be cancer, the survival rate on ovarian cancer is not very good. So what happened with her, which would probably happen to any of us, is the moment you hear the word, you have cancer, in her mind, she began running a movie, literally a movie of her future that would go all the way through treatments, hair loss, emaciation, death, funeral, and her daughter growing up without her mom. And that would just replay over and over and over and over. So, someone comes along, oh, you can have faith. If you can just believe, you can be healed. So she takes the cognition, I'm healed, but what keeps happening? That movie, that tape keeps playing over and over and over again, right? So it does no good to hear in your head, I can be healed. By his stripes I was healed. When you've got a movie that just keeps opening up, right? So what she did, this is so cool. What she did was she would take that movie and fit it inside, in her mind, fit it inside a television screen. And then in her mind, take a sledgehammer and smash that television screen. And then replace that movie with a new movie of going in and having the doctors look at new x-rays and say, we don't know what happened. There was definitely something here. There's nothing here. We don't get it. And start affirming that as reality rather than the other. We did the same thing when we adopted Elijah. They were telling us there was no way. And I would run through my mind the last day that we'd have to give him away and pack up all his stuff and never see him again and all that stuff. And so I realized I've got to start playing a new tape. So I would go in my basement and I would project a new imagination of walking into that courtroom, of hearing the judge bring down, the gavel, of seeing the documents that he was our son, right? So I would immerse myself in that movie instead of this movie. Consequently, we adopted Elijah. Some of you were there for that event. Shelley, it was crazy. They had just taken the thing. She comes over to our house the night before. She and Steve come over the night before that she's going up to schedule the surgery. And she says, I just want you to agree with me that they decided to do new x-rays. Which didn't make sense because there would be no reason, or ultrasounds or whatever it was, no reason for the insurance to even cover that because they had just taken them. So we agree. So she goes up there. They say, well, I'll tell you what, if it really is cancer, we can wait 6 months, see if it grows, and then make a decision. So that was an agreement that they left the doctor's office with. They get almost out the doctor's office, and the medical assistant, whatever, comes and says, you know what, the doctor changed his mind. Wants to take another ultrasound and then make a decision. Schedules the other ultrasound. Radiologists look at it. We don't get it. There was something showing up on this ultrasound. There's nothing showing up on this ultrasound. It was exactly the movie that she had played in her mind for her future. But see, here's the point. If she'd have just been trying to believe, you get it? Without dealing with the structure and working with the structure to change not only the content of her thinking, but the structure of her thinking. I don't know if she would have sat down in the kingdom of heaven and gotten the same result. I remember going into, when they told us we were going to lose Elijah, going in and sitting with the caseworkers from social services, and I'll never forget our caseworker looking me in the eye and apologizing and saying, "I'm so sorry I placed him with you. If I'd realized any of this, I never would have placed him in your home. And when you have to let him go, we will connect you with grief counselors and stuff like that will help you through the process." I'll never forget the child protection worker looking at me in tears and saying, "I know this is where he belongs, but I have to do my job. There's nothing else I can do." And being able to tell her, "It's okay, we're going to be fine. We are people of faith." And that quickly it shifted. And we were one of the cases that got audited after the fact. Well, right before we did the adoption. And we're sitting with the auditor, and the auditor looks at the case and says, "Well, wow, this just looks like a slam dunk. We don't ever see this." So I'm not just preaching theory. I'm telling you, you can change your future. You can change your reality, but you got to do it from the inside out. You can't wait for something to change out there to change something in here. You've got to get out of the consciousness and the levels of consciousness in which you are stuck. You've got to leave your father's house. You've got to leave your country. You've got to get out of your comfort zone and be willing, like Hebrews 11 says, and I know I'm going long, but here's what it says. He dwelt like a stranger in a foreign country. He dwelt in the land of promise like it was a foreign country. And here's the interesting thing. You know you're changing when you adopt a belief, you adopt a vision for yourself, you adopt a new agreement, and it doesn't quite feel right because it's so strange to you. That's when you know that real change is taking place. Because if it doesn't feel foreign, you're just going to go back to the old agreements and keep replicating and reproducing the same outcomes. So you have to be able to get through the awkward stage of leaving where you are and occupying the new place, and realize the temptation is going to be to want to go back to what's familiar because it seems secure. Make sense? Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. God bless you. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that was helpful to you.